Thank you everyone for coming along today to hear from our guest speaker, Andrew Markerink, as part of History Week. On behalf of the history team here at the City of Sydney, and in fact all of the people that work at the City, I pay my respects to the traditional owners of this land that we're speaking on today. I acknowledge that we work and create on country on the land of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and I pay my respects to elders past and present, always was, always will be Aboriginal land. Before we begin, we have a little bit of housekeeping to go through. So we are recording today's talk, so if there's anything you want to catch up on, the talk should be up on YouTube in a couple of weeks, if not sooner. Also, the talk is being interpreted in Auslan, and I just wanted to say a huge thank you to Katie, who's doing that for us today. We would love to hear what you think about today's event. And so we have a culture count survey, which we are going to put up on the PowerPoint display at the end of the talk, and we're also going to send that out to you. So please let us know what you think. So a bit of background about History Week. History Week is the History Council of New South Wales' annual statewide celebration of history. History Week's been going since 1997, and each year covers a different theme. So this year, the theme is Marking Time, and it invites us to consider how we commemorate, celebrate, or remember history. So the City of Sydney's history team considered this topic, and we thought it'd be a really great opportunity to hear from Andrew Markerink. Andrew's a master clockmaker who's worked on Sydney's oldest and largest clocks, and this includes the clock at Sydney Town Hall. If you've ever been lucky enough to come on a clock tower tour, it's really quite extraordinary. And also the clock which is on the front of this building. Andrew has had a lifelong passion for horology. He traces his family's connections to the profession back to the 18th century. His work involves both watch and clockmaking, as well as conservation and restoration across Australia. He also trains watch and clockmakers throughout Australia and New Zealand. So please join me in welcoming Andrew to hear about timekeeping and some of Sydney's timepieces across time. Thank you.
Good afternoon. I'm just going to go back just one shot because one of my favourite photos is in that title page. That is two very smartly dressed, because they do have a really nice hat on, as they're hanging off the front of Sydney Town Hall. So they're attached by, as you can see, nothing. And they're sitting on a bosun's chair, so a little piece of wood strapped in by a hemp rope, from the very, very top of Sydney Town Hall. So capture that image in your mind, and then go and have a look at Town Hall and just wonder how crazy a thing that actually is. So, a bit of fun. It is my favourite picture in Sydney Town Hall. There we go. Okay. So thank you for being part of History Week, and thank you for coming along today. So it's wonderful to see you all in the room, and hopefully I'll be able to give you a brief look and a bit of a touch also of some of Sydney's iconic landmarks with regard to clocks that exist around. So a little bit about myself before we set the hands forward. I've been privileged to be part of Sydney's heritage and history by restoring many of the public clocks in Sydney, which include Hyde Park Barracks, Paddington Town Hall, Glebe Town Hall, Sydney Town Hall, Customs House just above our heads. There's a couple in a few of the smaller streets, in Kent Street, York Street, and the like, as we sort of scatter ourselves around the city. So when things like daylight savings comes around, you know that I might be a little bit busy changing time. I I hope that today we can let you into a little bit of what we do behind the dials of those clocks and show you in some of the wonderful clocks that we have in this built environment, because we do have some quite amazing things. Things that have been put on display and on exhibition in England prior to them coming out as being great, wonderful marvels of engineering when they were first built, and we'll look at those things as we go through. For centuries, clockmakers have worked before me and keeping our public clocks alive. And yes, it's without doubt that the ticking sound of a clock does have a sense of life. The clockmakers that perform their task are referred to as the keeper of clocks, and a title that meant that you were responsible for keeping the clocks running and on time. The keeper of clocks would be one that kept them lubricated and running, and by the magic they performed as a clockmaker, these clocks seem to have performed by themselves without any human intervention. And unfortunately, a lot of people do think that clocks do perform forever without any human intervention. Big mistake, unfortunately. Time and clocks have a mystery about them that's like no other. The keeper of clocks included all of the early colonial clock and watchmakers of importance, and itself is a wonderful piece of history. We often stumble upon signatures and scratches on names and the keepers of clocks as they worked and installed clocks in Sydney. My fellow watchmaker and TAFE teacher Trent Firth is the current keeper of information, and he is a fount of knowledge for the colonial clockmakers and the wealth of information that's around that evolution of the industry as it comes out here. Clockmaking is a trade like no other. It crosses between being an engineer, a craftsman, and a tradesman, and we also become sort of minor historians by a bit of default, because we stumble around in it and we sort of bump into it and sort of can't recognise that it's actually not there. And I think it's that nice mix which makes it really fun to be in and a wonderful thing to be able to be part of. And that's what we get to be part of. When you're sitting on the top of buildings like Glebe Town Hall, unfortunately this is probably at 4 o'clock in the morning on a daylight savings morning, you do get benefits of being able to see back across the city skyline from unbelievable vantage points. But we also get to enjoy those few little moments before stepping back up and climbing yet another clock tower on that particular night, and up and down, up and down. I don't know how many thousands of stairs we climb on that night, and the other night of the year we change it, but it is a great privilege to be able to see a little bit of it. If I was an electrician that kept the light bulbs burning, a little bit like those in the city skyline there, or a plumber that ensured the water came out of your tap at home, I'm fairly certain you wouldn't really want to be here, because I don't think you'd want to be talking about what came out of those pipes. Time is a little bit different and a little bit more interesting a subject, I hope. But then again, I've actually been pointed out the fact that if you really start to look at the plumbing of Sydney, it's pretty interesting in itself. Okay. A ticking clock in a house brings a heartbeat that's unmistakable. A grandfather clock ticks at once per second, so it's a little bit like a calm heart rate. And clients often say that when a clock stops in their house, like a grandfather clock, that there's something missing. It loses the essence of the home, and there's something that's lost, like a personality is lost or a member of the family is lost in there. And I've always wondered, with that sort of concept in your mind, that a slow tick, a slow heart rate that calms you down, that Sydney Town Hall beats not once a second, but once every second and a quarter, so a little bit slower. If you go to the GPO, the massive GPO clock, it beats at 1.5 seconds, a little bit slower. If you then step around the corner and you go to Hyde Park Barracks, it slows down to once every 2 seconds. So if we could actually just slow down and listen maybe to the ticking of the clocks that's actually in our built environment, maybe we'd become a little bit calmer. And the interesting thing is that I just gave you those in the inverse relationship of the way they arrive. Hyde Park Barracks turns up first, building's 1817, with a 2-second pendulum, and I think with probably a calmer city in 1817. GPO, 1.5 seconds, and Sydney Town Hall, 1.25 seconds, and then of course you start to eventually end up with all sorts of things that go a lot faster. So maybe there's a little quirk in history there that as we become an older colonised country, that we also become a little bit faster and our clocks of earlier times were a little bit slower. And as a concept of just what a 2-second pendulum looks like, that's it. It's 2 stories tall. So that's the size of the pendulum. That's actually its sister. That's made by Villamy, as is the clock at Hyde Park Barracks. The pendulum being 2 stories long is the reason why it swings so slowly. But a fantastic thing. And that is a timber rod too, just out of interest. And it is so heavy that the only way you can pick that up is picking it up with a jack. You cannot literally, one person or 2 people also can't pick that up because the massive bulb that's at his feet is ridiculously heavy. So I'm lucky to be part of the lives of clocks as large as the GPO clock, which, has anyone got any idea roughly how heavy that might be? Weight of a car? Weight of a bus? Weight of 2 buses? It's 25 tonnes. 25 tonnes. So it's an enormous thing, and it becomes an enormous thing when we did that restoration. Of course, that means that 25 tonnes where the clock has to go from the top of the GPO to the bottom of the GPO to be repaired, and then taken back up the 11 floors to the top of the GPO. So size and those sort of things, that's an extraordinarily large thing. And it was that one that was actually put on display in England before it comes out. It was built by Joyce's, J.B. Joyce. And Joyce, it was such a marvel of technology at the time. It was on display in London for some time. But there's also the incredible Gillette flatbed clock. So it's a similar format that's in the top of Sydney Town Hall. And you can go all the way from those enormous clocks to the clocks that's above our head, which is the Tuanagi clock on the level 3 here at Customs House. They all have a story to tell in conservation, they all have a history to tell, and they all, fortunately, are operating. Clockmaking for myself, I often say, has its own echo in time with a foundation in my family in the 18th century in Holland and France. And I was drawn to engineering associated with clockmaking from a small child. And I was just speaking to a gentleman to my right as I was sitting down who told a similar story. I pulled my mum and dad's alarm clocks apart and saw pieces go flying. They caught most of them, but then in my wildest dreams at probably the age of 4 and 5, thought that I was going to be able to put that back together again. That didn't happen. So the takeaway, I guess, for me, and that was the great thing, is that my mum and my dad both celebrated that fact. I still to this day have no idea why, but I do thank my mum for her tolerance and my dad for his passing on his engineering skills to allow me to get to where I am. Australia's had wonderful clockmakers and watchmakers, and I've been lucky to work with several talented ones over the years that helped me along my clock and watchmaking path. And we've been very much gifted with some extremely talented ones. And New Zealand has the same sort of concept. And I think our isolation breeds a skill level that's a little bit different. We have to be self-reliant, and we can't rely on an industry that's quite large as you would in Europe or England. Often clock and watchmaking are confused as being the same, but they are distinctly different. And it's a little like driving a car as to riding a bike. Both are going to take you somewhere, but they're completely different. And I'll give you a little bit of an insight as to why there's some differences when we come down to size. I'm just going to grab the other mic. Oh, stuck in there. There we go. I think we've got that back up. Fantastic. So when we get to watchmaking, bear in mind I can have one on the wrist so you can think of all the pieces that are inside that are so smaller than what we're going to be dealing with here today. A speed governor for a normal grandfather clock, something you're going to have at home, so that's going to be governing the speed to which your striking system or chiming system run, is about that big. So fairly small. The clock in it, the GPO is made by JB Joyce's, 25 tonnes, so you've got to bear in mind you've got to have some fairly decent sized parts in that 25 tonnes. So when we want to go to a speed governor for a 25 tonne clock, that's what we're looking at. This is the clock we're building for the GPO in Adelaide. It is slightly smaller than the governor that exists here in Sydney. And out of interest, the clock at the GPO Sydney in its day was the third biggest in the world. So it was an enormous thing. It still rates up as one of the biggest that actually exist anywhere in the world. So again, when you're talking at small parts or big parts, that's the what's called a ratchet wheel that would exist for winding of a clock, and that's in what you would expect in a normal domestic clock. But then when we go to the baby of the room, which is something like the size of Sydney Town Hall, you end up with one of these. That's the ratchet wheel for the old one that was damaged out of Sydney Town Hall. And if you can see closely at the top, it's had a little bit of dental work. We've struck this with Gillette. Gillette, one of the problems they have is with this wheel, it shreds the teeth out of it. And at one of the clocks we did, which is St John's at Camden, a whole section of teeth has been shredded out of it, and they simply had a red piece of tape and a little sign that said, "Don't stop here." Good idea not to stop there because there's a real reason for not stopping there. This would have been attached to around about a 500 kilogram weight, and you would have been attached to it by the handle that you were using to wind the clock at the time. So if you had stopped where those teeth were missing, you would have held onto in your bare hands 500 kilograms worth of weight. And that in itself is problematic. Because I know I don't weigh 500 kilograms, so I struggle to hold on to that. You have got a slight gear advantage with a very large winding crank. But one of those failing often leads to people dying or severe injury. The one that's local, Maitland, in New South Wales, one did fail. He broke his arm, several ribs, his collarbone, his jaw, and he did come out alive, but often that's not the case. We'll look at a few more of those things a little later on. So there's a difference between a domestic clock and what you'd actually see with something like the size of a town hall clock. They're often huge, but not always huge. Customs House here above us, you could actually pick up that movement by yourself. The whole mechanism you could actually lift up and carry away. Really lovely thing, but when you're getting all the way up to the really big end of town where you've got massive sets of bells and huge hammers, and you want these clocks to be seen and heard from a long way away, they too have to be very big. The clock itself weighs 25 tonnes. The hands that are on the GPO weigh 1 tonne by themselves. So there's 1,000 kilograms just in the four sets of hands, or the 8 hands that are on the outside of that building. Okay, training has always been a focus for my work, and I've been involved with teaching at TAFE and workshops overseas and here in Australia. I strongly believe that the most important thing we can do is in fact to actually pass on our knowledge, and passing on our knowledge is something that if we all do it, then we can't blame our next generation for doing something wrong, because they should have learnt from us, so it should be our fault by rights. We often think of as a watchmaker as an old man with an eyeglass tucked up in the back of a room. in some small little shop. That used to be a common thing. I know when I was a kid, there was always a watchmaker in the back of a room somewhere and tinkering away, doing something with an eyeglass seemingly permanently stuck to his eye. I think that image has changed. Just trying to find a shop that's got a watchmaker in it now is actually a bit of a trick. But I know I seem to be rapidly approaching the image of the grey-haired old man that's actually in the back of the shop with an eyeglass stuck in his eye. But the industry's changed. It has changed dramatically. The people that are involved now in the profession, it's a bit of that craft trade profession, have also changed. Men, women, it's sort of 50-50-ish nowadays, and the nature of the product now has changed. As amazing as a 25-tonne clock is, I also find equally amazing that the highest price gained this year for a wristwatch is $174 million US. One watch. It's nearly the price of a one-bedroom unit in Sydney. It's outrageous. But it's changed. We have changed so much in the last generation that it's quite ridiculous. That we have clocks and watches that have become this ridiculous state of the art, which once upon a time it used to be cutting edge. When the Joyce clock was built for the GPO in Sydney, it was state of the art, cutting edge engineering. And you'd sort of think at one point in time those evolutionary things are going to stop, but the reality is they just keep going on and keep changing. I think I might have missed a slide here as well. Yeah. Our recent restoration of the 1821, that's this one here. It's a clock made by Thwaites and Reed in England, and that's St John's Parramatta Cathedral clock. So that's an amazing clock in itself, but quite fascinating in what it is and what it's become. Now I'm trying to read my own writing. I'm probably getting closer to the eyeglass person in the back of the room. So the interesting thing about that is that once you've actually walked into that room, you do get a sense of the age that's associated with where you're at and a little bit of the history that's actually passed before you. Because not only are you walking in to see something that's plainly incredibly old at 1821 for Australian history, but you also feel the presence of everybody else that's walked in there. You see the wear and the rungs of the steps. You see the marks on the wall where people's hands have passed up, and you see the detritus of what's been left behind and little bits of repairs and marks and the like. Unfortunately, though, the other thing that we often see is the damage that's occurred to these pieces. And it's where I take my hat off to the City of Sydney, because I think they've had, for a lot longer than most people, and also in New South Wales, a much stronger focus on preserving history and preserving heritage. So willing to go the extra mile, that extra step, to be able to make sure that the originality of something is kept and that something's not changed just for the sake of change. An example of that, I guess, would be a recent clock in Launceston in Tasmania, which we tried to intervene with, but unsuccessfully, where a perfectly fine running 1860s Gillette tower clock, which has been running and also just restored by a local clockmaker in Tasmania, was electrified 2 months ago. Just because the council was convinced by somebody that electrifying it was a good thing to do. It wasn't a good thing to do. So this important piece has been changed, it's been altered, and it's been, as soon as you change, altered, cut up things, break things, move things, you do that permanently. You don't get to come back at it and say, oh gee, I wish I hadn't done that. It's too late. So the fact that we've been doing that, and I think the City of Sydney has been doing that incredibly well, is, I think, an incredible thing, and something I really do take my hat off to them for doing just that and looking after that history. It's not universal, unfortunately. I read a recent book a little while ago, and I must say, and I went back to it, I remembered a quote that was sort of roughly in, and it was actually the book was Bringing Time to the Colony. I think it was written about 20 odd years ago. In it, Emily Moffat, who was living in Matabeleland in 1861 in South Africa, writes, "You must know that today we unpacked our clocks and we now seem a little more civilised. An interesting observation, and I guess we sort of look back at that sort of that statement with a different view nowadays. Colonisation, whether in South Africa or Australia, saw Europeans arriving in land that they often considered uncivilised, in need of taming. Emily writes that time itself seems to have left Matabeleland without civilisation. We know as time passes around each of us that seeing a clock tells us the time and at least shows it's passing, but doesn't bring us any closer to any sense of being civilised, but can let us know that we have no way of stopping its progress. Little by little, time rolls forward and never goes backwards. If the emu and the kangaroo, as part of our coat of arms, can't go backwards, time itself can't either. The only way to know where it's been is take a few steps back into history and peek at some of the people and also some of the things that have actually been there that show us what's occurred. The Labor Party's campaign was once upon a time, and I think you all probably remember it, it's time. It was a slogan that tried to tell us that we all needed change, and it was a successful one, it seemed. Good or bad, time will always change. For Sydney, the arrival of white settlers at Sydney brought with it the first big change in time and timekeepers. They were, interestingly enough, at the time when Cook comes in, at the cutting edge, again, of navigational timekeeping, and they had on board what was called K1. K1 is Kendall's #1 copy of the Harrison #4, and you probably heard that and went, la, 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 I don't know what that is. That's fine. Harrison was the person that actually was given the task in a way of a clock to be allow us to navigate at sea, to be able to perfectly know where we were and find ourselves and not be lost, and not have ships run ashore, with the great impetus for that being the fact that an entire fleet was run ashore. And if anybody else on board was to question the navigator at that time, before precise navigation, they were executed. It was a simple thing. You could never doubt the navigator's positioning. One person on board this particular ship goes to the navigator and says, by the way, I don't believe where you say we are, which would have meant with death as a consequence. But he, in his faith in his knowledge, felt that he was going to die anyway. Turned out he was right. They ran that entire fleet of ships aground, and one of the boats in that, one of the ships in that fleet was actually saved. And you go on, and that pushes the impetus to be able to allow these clocks to be produced through Harrison. He produces 4 of them. And these are amazing things. And Kendall then produces K1, which is on board of Cook's Endeavour, and he used that for navigational purposes, and hence it derives. So we have, right at the very start of our history, amazing pieces of technology which turn up at our shores, but not on shore. And when you're trying to control a colonial society, one of the things you really need is a clock. And that's a picture of the very first little one that's sitting at the very top, is a brick tower, unfired bricks they used because they weren't firing bricks in the early colony, and they built this tower, and that was originally at the, I just remember the park that it was actually in. I wish I've written that down, but I've skipped past. Just the bottom of, near the Anglican church down at the bottom of York Street is where it sits. It fell over, and I guess the reality of that, it was sort of showed you just how shaky European civilization was at the same time as the existing culture that was already here was pretty stable and pretty happy and enjoying the fruits and what have you of Sydney Harbour, while we were desperately trying in 1797-98 to be able to build a clock tower that didn't stand up for more than 2 years, and the first real storm that came through blew it over. The fascinating thing about that is that the clock that would have been in the top of that tower would have been very expensive and very important and is very lost. It was never reused, and where it's gone to, like several clocks that appear through history, they just vanish into the ether and we never see them again. So when Sydney was first settled, an Aboriginal population was thriving in this environment and was in sync with it. And the new inhabitants, the white explorers, hung on by a thread. And I guess that's a good example of how we were trying to hold on and trying to sort of work our way into this little area that we didn't do particularly well. So our first attempt to control this land is pretty much by time itself, because when you've got a convict population, one of the things you really need to do is to be able to control that society in a very strict sort of format. It was Lang Park in the bottom of York Street, now that I've just found that, sorry about that. So they tried and tried again and again. This particular clock is the one from the Women's Factory at Parramatta. It's within that heritage precinct at North Parramatta. And it's an interesting one because if you remember the one we just saw just a second ago, it's the sister to the one at St John's Cathedral, and we'll talk about those in just a little second. So it's time essentially for the colony to try again. And the biggest input that exists within Australia for clockmaking actually comes from King George, who gives us the colony a gift of clocks in 1821 and 1826. This particular one is one of the 1821 clocks, and as is the one at St John's Cathedral in Parramatta as well. And they're an interesting thing if you try to look at them. I'm going to go for a little walk over to that slide. They are what's called a posted frame clock. So if you can see that they've got little nuts on all the corners and they're plates that actually form. So if you imagine if you've already built a clock tower and you are trying to get a clock into the top of the tower, when the clock is enormous and there are no holes apart from the dials holes and the clocks are bigger than the dials, you've got to be able to get them up there in some way, shape or form. So this is the IKEA of clockmaking in 1821 because they flat pack. All you needed was essentially you can put one of these together with a shifter pretty much. I don't know if they had shifters in 1821, but I'm pretty certain they didn't. So they would have arrived, the first 7 of them, flat packed. So they would have been laid down flat and all their bits and pieces, and they would have been reassembled when they got here, and they would have been reassembled in the clock tower itself, and they're sort of put together on cobbled timber frames. Women's Factory, if you know the history of that building, has been changed several times and that tower has been altered. But the nice and easy thing about that for us is that we can actually very easily undo the IKEA clock and take it downstairs, rebuild it all, then put it back together in the shop, run it in the shop, pull it all apart again and take it back up on the top of the clock tower. And the only thing that's holding it on, and I'll just wander over and show those. Those little J-hooks, that's all that holds them in place. That and gravity itself and the fact that they're ridiculously heavy when you throw on 300 and 400 kilograms with a driving weight off the bottom of it. So that was the first big change that occurred. Just find where I'm up to, sorry about that. So what you end up having is that clocks arrived often after the building does. And the real issue there is that the clock itself is a very expensive item, and often as expensive an item as was the building itself. So in this particular instance, you can see the circular hole on the top of the church building. This is in Tasmania, where they were desperately hoping that one day enough scones and jam would actually mean the fundraisers would work and they will have actually bought themselves a clock, or that someone like King George would have gifted them one as well. And a lot of them did end up in Tasmania as well. And we've done several of the ones in Tasmania that arrived in those shipments as well. To me, though, what you have happen now is that little round circular architectural feature is often now seen in project homes. So as a clockmaker, I look at those things and thinking, oh my goodness, there's a lot of clocks I have to install. So at one point in time, we're going to be very, very busy when everyone suddenly realises the architectural feature they've got on the top of their project home is actually for me. So I will be there. So we're looking forward to that little change in business. We start installing lots and lots of them. They were really expensive, a stupidly expensive thing. And as you can see from the fact that kings give them away as presents, will give you a bit of an idea. That's support of the industry that exists, and they were built by Thwaites and Reed, who were the clockmakers to the Crown at the time. So one of my favourite buildings is Hyde Park Barracks, one of our oldest, 1817. And at the time, our very celebrated clockmaker was James Oatley. James was the person that actually installed the first clock into Hyde Park Barracks. And he becomes quite celebrated and also quite prolific, and you would know the Oatley name from the suburb in Sydney, or from the eventual family's connection with the wine industry, or with yacht racing, with wild oats, etc., etc. So a clockmaker leaves a long legacy at times. And James is the name that's still used by kids in that family as it goes through. Most clockmakers, such as James Oatley, would never have dealt with rain, storms or hail on their domestic clocks in someone's lounge room. So he would have been familiar with the tiny little parts that we showed you, but not quite with the sort of big end of town where you need to be producing clocks that are enormous to be able to deal with pigeons sitting on the minute hand, or the winds whipping across Sydney Harbour at 100 kilometres an hour on a stormy day, or the hail falling, and those sorts of things. So the problem that existed with that is that he built a clock, we think, because it also doesn't exist either, that went into Hyde Park Barracks and was also not successful. It didn't actually work for a terribly long period of time. So what ends up happening is that the Oatley clock is removed, but he still has a foothold. It still is a little bit of a mark or a hole that's left by James Oatley in his first clock, and that's with this section. The piece that's sitting in the front, the two hands, the gold-leafed hands, and that framework behind is the only Oatley part left of the Hyde Park Barracks. Those hands have been repaired a million times. So probably a little bit light for where they were meant to be. They've been broken and sort of redone. So hopefully they'll be there for another few hundred years and before they need to become, because we've now completely wrapped them in gold. Normally the gold leaf only goes in the front, but when we did them, we used a slightly thicker gold leaf and we literally wrapped them in gold. So they're hopefully sealed for a lot longer. So it's a nice little part of that history that still stays there. And this is where we start to get another little overlay, because the clock that comes in there is actually then the new one is by Vullamy. Vullamy has a nice collection that's us taking the dial up to the top of Hyde Park Barracks. And I hate that on that day, because the person I hated most there is not similar to the person at the back of the room doing the filming, but when you've got cameras on you, when you're actually taking your dial up on a windy day, it does add a little bit of extra stress. Of course, you can guarantee that'll be the day you'll drop it. And that's it, the show that actually did make it there, and that we didn't actually drop it. But Vullamy, coming back to that, Vullamy's clock is actually the one that's in there, and that's the one with our massive two-storey pendulum, the very, very long one. That's actually the one that's still on the top of the building. Vullamy has got a nice little history to the clock at Westminster, known as Big Ben, which is actually the name of the bell in London. But the clock at Westminster was originally going to be made by Vullamy, and there was some delays in handing that contract out to Vullamy, and that delay of a few years was actually a technological change that occurred within tower clocks, and that change is what's called the gravity escapement. And that was made by a man by the name of Lord Grimthorpe. Lord Grimthorpe is the one that puts the clock escapement, the ticking part of a clock, that's the escapement. The ticking part of the clock is called the escapement, and that's the one that's in our clock at the GPO in Sydney, and that's why it was put on display in the first instance when it was built. As that technology is advanced through that contract being let to Vulemi, instead Dents end up with the contract, and Dents then install the clock that is currently in at the clock at Westminster, Big Ben, and hence Vulemi does not end up with it, but we end up with a Vulemi clock at Hyde Park Barracks, installed in 1835. So a little bit of twisted history, or a little bit of sort of crossing over paths as it comes through. And the other nice little element to that is that in end of October, Keith Scobie-Young, who was the restorer through Cumbria Clocks in England, is lecturing here in Australia, and he's lecturing on the restoration for the Great Clock, as is referred to more accurately, rather than Big Ben, which is the name of the bell. So there's a nice little flow over. And he, very excitingly, is extremely keen to go and see the clock, of all things, at Sydney Town Hall. You would think a man that's probably seen more tower clocks anywhere else in the world than any single clockmaker, but he's very keen to come and have a look at the one at Sydney Town Hall, so which is very exciting to have him. So nice little changes that exist as we go through. This is the clock, that's the Vulemi clock in at Hyde Park Barracks. Looks ridiculously simple, but it is one of the most enjoyable clocks to sit and watch. It's if you reflect back to that 2-second pendulum, so if you can hear a clock ticking so slowly at once every 2 seconds, and in the top of Hyde Park Barracks, quite quiet, it's just lovely. It's the best way to describe it. You just really if you put a little cafe up there and had a glass of wine there and a few little nibbles, you'd pry me out of there with a crowbar. It's a fantastic spot. But it's a little bit hard to say in size and picture, but in fact that size that's there is probably a little bit larger than that picture shows. So you can put your arms across it. So it's not much bigger than what it shows in that picture. Again, posted frame. You can see how all the little strap pieces can all be pulled apart and taken out of the tower, typical of what the earlier clocks actually look like. Okay, so we've actually been able to figure out how to tell time by people reading the hands. One of the other big things that occurs is that we start to have the need as the built environment, all the things in the city start to become larger and larger. We need to be able to hear it as well. Sydney Town Hall, interestingly enough, when it was first installed, there was nothing really between it all the way over the glebe, so you could hear the bells from Sydney Town Hall being rung at glebe, which is a long way away. I would challenge you to hear Sydney Town Hall chime at the other end of the Queen Victoria building nowadays. The difference is enormous. The sound, all the noises of the city slowly come up, and all the height of the buildings slowly come up. And as a result, if you look at the models downstairs under the floor at the ground floor when you come into Customs House, you'll see how enclosed Sydney Town Hall has become. And as a result of that, we either need to get loud or we need to get taller, higher, bigger. So when size does matter, the bells are really important. This is actually not the bells in Sydney at the GPO. It's actually the bells we're currently doing at Adelaide. But over to the right is a spectacular picture which I love, which is looking down onto the bells at Sydney Town Hall. The biggest bell that we've got in town is the GPO, the strike bell on that being 5 tonnes all by itself. And it is a wonderful little piece of history. You often think, how can a bell be? It's a bell's a bell's a bell. When you see them, they are spectacular. You definitely don't want to bump your head into them because they don't want to move. The GPO bell holds one of the only, or the only, publicly visible eternity symbols. So Arthur Stace, when Arthur Stace was going around Sydney putting his little eternity everywhere, or writing eternity I should say, the only one spot that's left to be seen is inside the bell, the 5-tonne bell at the GPO. And the question is, because that's a restricted access, how he got there and how it got there is the unknown question. Because you have to have climbed up through the clock. You've got to go through the lower security levels, the doors above it, they're all locked, and etc., all the way eventually up to this massive steel sliding plate, because the last thing you want to be doing is sitting inside a clock, repairing a clock, or even in the area of the clock when 5 tonnes and the other massive bells above you start going off, because you literally cannot hear yourself scream. I've had the misfortune of being inside a bell at a church, so a bell that covers me pretty much, when some kindly child decided to turn up and play the bells manually, and you can play a tune. So he started playing 2 or 3 floors down while I was tucked up inside the bell, and as I screamed, I literally realised I couldn't hear myself screaming, so there was no chance he was going to hear me screaming down the bottom. It's a noise like no other. They're designed to be heard over kilometres, so when you're inside one, you definitely know it's ringing. So they seal all this off, so bear in mind all of that is sealed away, and yet Arthur Stace is still able to get to the top right eternally inside the bell, and then walk away. It's either that, or one other interesting point with the GPO is that the GPO was pulled down for the Second World War. And the reason for it being pulled down is it's at the GPO. It's the hub of all of our communication for the Second World War. So leaving a massive clock tower on the top of the communications hub is like painting it with a little cross and saying, bomb this building. So they pulled it all the way down the bottom. The very end, the last slide that we'll play is a video in the National Archive which actually shows you how that's being pulled down piece by piece by piece and eventually is put back up again in the 1960s. And the other interesting thing about the fact that they put back our largest mechanical clock, they put that back together in the 1960s, and not a single clockmaker was involved in the process of putting it back, just engineers. And it's a very big difference, same as there is between domestic clockmaking and tower clockmaking to being an engineer, mechanical engineer, and being a clockmaker. Horological engineering is quite a different element altogether. So that eternity symbol inside this bell, in fact, is quite an extraordinary thing. But this bell is quite an extraordinary thing. So that's our 5-tonne bell that arrives on the top of the tower at the GPO, and having a bit of a look at that, you'll think, okay, how does that bell, which is currently, when it was just made in England, and you can just see the little boat that's in front of it. It's a little canal boat. So it was produced by Joyce's, and they eventually put it on canal boat, and they ship it by canal boat, and that then moves slowly but surely into London, and then in London it gets put onto a sailing boat, and then it gets sailed out to Sydney, gets unloaded, and then somehow or another, with a clock tower already together, they get that bell inside the top, plus all the others. But the sheer size of that, I bring onto site 70-tonne cranes and all those sorts of things, and it's fantastic and easy, and they're amazing, and they're very manoeuvrable. But when you're doing it like this with block and tackle and manhandling these things, I think that is an incredible effort. So really amazing. So that's the its move on the 12th of April 1891 before it heads out to Australia, which is a spectacular picture that just by serendipity arrived on my desk 3 days ago. So it's just fantastic. The bell ringers are an amazing campanologists. They're amazing people. They do some incredible things, and it's a friend of mine that rings bells and also fits bells still into clock towers around the country that sent that over to me, Ron Shepherd. Sydney Town Hall bells are an interesting one as well. So bear in mind, the idea is to let people hear the sound. Sydney Town Hall bells are not actually Sydney Town Hall's bell. I actually feel at some point in time someone from Ballarat is going to come along and say, actually, you've got our bells there. Because marked on the bells in the old spelling of Ballarat is the word Ballarat, and every single one of the bells in Sydney Town Hall. So somehow or another, someone is changed where they've got to go to, or for some reason or other we've snaffled them, or for some priority we've ended up with these amazing bells. And they are an amazing bell. They're actually considered to be the best sounding Westminster chiming bells that actually were made. They're really beautiful things. But that little history as to how they get here and why they've got Ballarat on them, which is definitely where they were destined for, how they end up on the top of Sydney Town Hall is a bit of an unknown one. So I think whoever was able to move a bit of paperwork around at the time when they were borrowed kept it very quiet. But they are a beautiful set of bells. So that's the dismantling. It's a bit of an idea of, I think it's as wonderful a picture, that particular one, as our two fine gentlemen with their lovely little hats on being hung by bosun's chairs in the front of Sydney Town Hall. It's just keep an eye out for it at the very, very end. That 5-ton bell will appear again, and it'll be attached to a single piece of cable, and there'll be a gentleman that'll be standing literally on the bell hammer. As the bell is spinning, he's jumping up and down on the bell hammer to make the bell strike while it's attached to a cable floating in midair. And he is attached to nothing. Nothing at all. He doesn't even have a bosun's chair or a smart hat. So today the sort of concept of OH&S and protection is a whole different story, but when it comes down to these sorts of things, that was just, let's just get it down and get it done. And nearly every single component, and that includes the sandstone pillars, were ridden to the ground by an individual. So they tie the pillars, sandstone pillars for the GPO, were wrapped with a rope, and a gentleman then just wraps his arms around the pillars and his fingers do not touch on the other side, and he rides it to the ground. So it is an event. So obviously the amusement parks were not open at that point in time, and they had another way to get to the ground. So fantastic things. So here's our two big babies. They're not actually the biggest in town. The GPO on the left is definitely the biggest mechanical clock in town, but I think there's a bit of difference between big and big. I think it's most important is probably what the best. There's two most important clocks in town. Sydney Town Hall, I think, and the GPO Sydney, I think, are the two most important. Meeting on the steps of Sydney Town Hall, I think, has occurred for so long that I think it has a landmark that makes it really important. I think it is an amazing clock. It's an incredible thing. But here's our change too. These are what's called flatbed clocks. Now the other ones we refer to are called posted frames, and these two are flatbeds. And so they have a massive cast iron bed, but that cast iron bed, if I just do it from the wall across, will be around about that long. So it's enormous, absolutely enormous. So as a clock for the Joyce one on the left, JB Joyce is a absolutely spectacularly huge thing, which is daunting when you get to walk up to it and realise you've actually got to carry it downstairs, and there's no mechanical lift, and it's got to go down by being handled physically all the way to the ground, 11 floors down. So a fun thing. Sydney Town Hall is a beautiful thing. It's actually in this really lovely cabinet, and you get these really nice images being sort of shadowed across the front of the glass on it too, which is really quite special as a clock in itself. The clock up the top of Sydney Town Hall, we often think that's the only one. It's the one that's always been there. But a little bit like Hyde Park Barracks, it too has a history where it's changed. In the first instance, the first clock that was up there was actually built by Weissner. He was a Sydney clockmaker, and that's where you get a little bit of extra pressure. When you're dealing with these things that have high profile, there's high prestige. 5 minutes, yep. High prestige, and we also end up with the reality that there's high risk. Unfortunately for Weissner, the only thing that actually is left inside the building is his name above the town clerk's office door, and the actual original clock that he installed also is lost and gone and doesn't seem to exist anywhere in history. He put in one-piece single glass dials on the George Street side. They blew out. Fortunately, no one died in that process, but they ended up blowing out to the ground as a result. And the Weissner one, if you get a chance, come up and have a look at it. That's the only Weissner clock I've ever actually seen other than that. That's the one at the front is Weissner Sydney. I think with his failure, and he also put his name on the dials as well of that particular clock. Probably not a good thing when it doesn't work. It's an anti-ad. I think it'd probably be something similar to that. But still nice that one still exists in Town Hall. Lovely thing. Now, if you remember this, go back just a couple, and I know I'm short on time here. That's the clock is restored, the blue one on the left. That's its original colour. On the right, that's the dials for the GPO when you're inside them, so you get a bit of a concept of just how big those dials are. And on the right is all the detritus that's been added to that clock over the decades as it's been changed. When it was fitted up in 1960, the problem with the fittings of it, which were done quite well, but with the absence of a clockmaker, they got the tolerances a little bit wrong, and they added all sorts of different things which didn't function particularly well. And the net result is that the clock failed and then was electrified. So what you see, all those motors on the bottom of them are electric systems, and then the systems that are on the top of them were fantastic. That was the real beauty, because they spoke to the clock, or spoke to the observatory at the rocks, and the pips, the pip generators were actually run from the clock at the GPO. So that highly accurate timekeeping that we actually were so used to, it originally derived itself from the GPO's clock because it was a really spectacularly high quality clock. And it had a link between the GPO clock and the observatory, and then to the time ball. So that the GPO was controlling shipping within the harbour by being up at Martin Place. Quite an incredible sort of little connection as it rolls through. But a massive, massive thing. Most of the systems that had been installed, as is typical of most clock towers, people didn't mind changing. There were 4 different electrical systems that were actually in there. All 4 of them are live, and all 4 of them were no longer in operation. But so it was. It took about 3 days for an electrician to finally find every live wire that was connected to all other parts of the building in that particular clock. So it was a bit of a risk. And the nice thing about that, Trent, who's standing there on the right-hand side, if he was to take a step to the left, he'd fall about 6 floors, because that's what's below his feet. Nothing. And we couldn't actually go past this one, which is Sydney Town Hall. It's Sydney Central Station. Sydney Central is our tallest in town. Of course, that's in the 1920s. And of course, as our built environment increases, so too does the height of the clock have to increase so people can see it. No use having a clock as low as the Sydney Town Hall because you couldn't see it anymore. So as a result, we end up with a very, very tall tower, and it's a beautiful, beautiful structure. And also couldn't help but putting the Mickey Mouse one in, which was a prank done by students at Sydney University. If anyone's in this room that actually did that, you can put your hand up, please. Thank you very much. Quite a feat. You bear in mind how tall that tower is, that they were able to get Mickey Mouse's image up behind the dials by hanging off from ropes from the very top, which is quite an effort. You've got to give them points for that. They should have graduated, probably with honours in engineering. But that's your walk up, and it's quite a hairy wander up. So if you ever do get the chance, Sydney Trains through the Heritage Department do a tour up there. It's actually worthwhile having a look, because it's really quite a wonderful walk up to the top as you go through. But again, back to my favourite, Sydney Town Hall. And I can't go past that. I think it's just such a beautiful building and an amazing clock. Thank you, everybody. And are there any questions? And I'm just going to play this next one. Oops. Going through. Skipping that one. There we go. That's the video that rolls through. It shows you the disassembly of the GPO as it goes through. Any questions?
If we have questions, I'll just bring the mic over to you.
Is it easier to regulate a slow clock or a faster clock Yeah, one that takes 2 seconds to swing or one that takes 1 second?
Much easier to be able to regulate a 2-second pendulum. There's a thing called the delta length, so how much you've got to move a pendulum to be able to change it for 1 minute per day. On a very, very long pendulum, like a 2-second pendulum, it's a massive amount. So if it's a massive amount, a small amount will make a tiny adjustment, so you can get really, really good accuracy. And bear in mind that one at the Hyde Park Barracks is a timber rod, so it doesn't expand and contract because it's end grain. So it's very stable. Really good timekeeper. Spectacular thing for a timber rod.
Just pop your hand up.
Okay, a tour of all of them is, there is a walking tour which I've done once upon a time, which Trent Firth, who's a TAFE teacher, actually has got, and it's a fantastic thing. It really is a worthwhile exercise. But he doesn't do it very often, was the problem. Sydney Open has the tour of the clock at Sydney Town Hall, and Sydney Open often at the same time have the clock at GPO, Martin Place, which is the Fullerton. Also, you can, if you're a guest, if you feel like going to go and have a look at the outside and stay there as a guest, they have an historian that will actually take you to show it off as well. So it's actually quite a nice thing. It's worthwhile looking at. It's a beautiful thing. And Sydney Trains do it also for Sydney Open as well, and occasionally do it another time as well. So they're the three that allow access. And the main reason being for restriction to those three is safety. The entrance into the GPO and Sydney Town Hall, spectacular. It's lovely. They're beautiful things. So there's a really nice thing. The governor's wife in Tasmania at Government House had her stairs covered in red carpet to be able to take guests to the top there. But so very lovely entrance, but they just forgot to restore the clock. That's the only thing. So yeah, we were notified on the fact that people had gone up there that knew a few things about clocks. Said, "Have you seen the condition of that thing? But the stairs are great." Anybody else?
Yes, I'll just give you the mic.
So what happened to the clock when the power was come on?
Okay. It was completely pulled apart as well. So everything that was there was put into stores around Sydney, not in the same spot for security. So they separated the entire thing, and obviously it was the knowledge of where all the pieces of marble. Are we going through that one, or didn't want to play, or did play? Didn't play. Okay. Sorry about that. It was put all around Sydney, and then eventually, quite a long time afterwards, before they put it all back together again. There were three main clocks at the GPO. Big Brother, which is this one. Oh, there we go. Little Brother, which hangs off the side out the front, and there was a third one that was actually put up for the war that was actually in Martin Place. They used to have underground toilets in Martin Place, and it was the entrance to there. That's now on the Central Coast. A client of ours that found that and restored it. Fortunately, it's now running in the front of his house. But at least it exists. He saved it from being destroyed. So, any other questions? Sorry. Yes. Mm-hmm. Yeah, that was built by Robert Bartholomew Smith, R.B. Smith. He was a clockmaker in Paddington in Sydney. An interesting guy. He actually built that clock and pretty much made himself a job for life working for the Science Museum because the clock really never worked that well. And what's lovely about it, though, and you've really got to love it, when you look at it, it's got a staircase in the back right-hand corner. He built it from a postcard, and the postcard had a perspective of the clock inside the Strasbourg Cathedral, and in the back corner of the Strasbourg is this spiral staircase, but he thought it was attached to the clock. So his has got a staircase attached to it. So that's why it's the Strasbourg at the powerhouse has got the staircase attached to it. But it's still a nice. It's a wonderful thing. But the engineering is probably it's been attempted to make run for long periods of time by lots of different people. But the fundamentals are it's got some design issues, but aesthetically it looks fantastic. It looks amazing. So, yeah, nice thing. There's Robert Bartholomew Smith, R.B. Smith, also makes the clock for Redfern Post Office. and Newtown Post Office as well. They're those two. Any other questions? Yes. Mid-19th century, I finished a tower clock. With what device do I calibrate the accuracy of the pendulum on the resting? Yeah. Yeah, it's actually why you're right. Smaller. It's the reason why we needed clocks in the colony, not watches, because watches were terribly inaccurate. So you couldn't use a watch to regulate a clock. You could use a sundial, and there you got to welcome mathematicians and astronomers, because that was the way they actually said it. If we've got time, there's this wonderful story written in the Athenian Courier in the 18th century. This gentleman walking around London. And he starts off in his walk, and he walks for 5 minutes and finds out it's taken him half an hour, because there was such localised time from block to block. Everybody's clock was completely different. Every public clock was different. So he walks for another half an hour and finds out he gets there an hour before he started off in the first place, for example. And that goes on and on and on. And the story is hilarious. And you think it's actually been written with some sense of jest about it, but in fact it's a fact. So the regulation of clocks really wasn't that important. It's only when things like trains turn up that it becomes important. If you're a minute out with a train coming at you at 100 kilometres an hour, it's a different story. You don't want two trains on the same track at the same time going the opposite direction. Not a good move. And that's why timekeeping in America improves dramatically as a result of that, railway timekeepers. To answer your question, sundials and tables and astronomy, etc., allow you to be really precise and set them, and then hope you've got really accurate clocks to maintain it. So calibration can take over a month? No, it can be done instantaneously. Back in the day, in the 11th century, the Chinese clockmaker Su Sung actually writes that his mechanical clock is actually perfectly accurate, because he was able to see the rise of a planet and say, yeah, my clock's on time. That sort of accuracy is thought to be pretty good. Yeah. Oh, that looks good. Yeah. That's about as much as you really needed, because who's going to tell you you're wrong? No one's around with I've got a GPS watch on my wrist, and I wasn't walking down the streets in the 1860s going, no, I think you're out by 2 seconds. Now, in fact, one of the interesting stories with regard to Sydney Town Hall is when we first restored it, we got a whole flood of complaints about the clock not being on time one period of time. And it was when Samsung had released one of their new phones, which was actually having a coding problem for the GPS satellites. So Sydney Town Hall was right, that mobile phone was wrong. Gentleman at the back.
I've got to ask, what is the chief timekeeper of Sydney? What wristwatch do you wear, sir?
Today, because I'm actually going to see another tower clock to go and set it this afternoon, that's the Seiko Astron. That's a GPS signal, so that's solar-powered, satellite-driven. But it's not what I wear every day of the week. So, yeah. Pleasure.
Okay. Are there any more questions from this side of the room? Or just 1 second.
I was hoping, do you know where the tune that the clock plays every hour, where that comes from?
We actually borrow, who actually writes it in the first instance, it's actually not originally out of Westminster Cathedral. That tune arrives before that. So its actual history, no, I don't know it. It becomes ridiculously popular, though, as a result of the clock at Westminster and Big Ben, or the Great Clock, whichever you want to refer to it as. But here, who writes that tune? I'm not sure. Good question. Sorry about that one.
We'll just have time for one more question. Yep, I'll just get the mic to you.
That dismantling take?
Oh, I don't know that exactly either. I imagine that would have been quite a process. I think it's one of those things, if you've ever pulled something apart, the pulling apart's a lot quicker than the putting back together again. I know as a child that I'm still working on Mum's clock, but so I don't think the process of disassemble was as quite as difficult as the assembling, but I don't know how long that took. Anybody else?
We'll just need to wrap up there because we're running
Super.
a bit over.
Excellent.
Thank you, everyone, for coming along. Thank you. Oh, your wallet. Don't forget your you'll need that. Thank you, everyone, so much for coming along and being part of History Week. I'd like to pay thanks to Katie for interpreting today. Thank you, Katie. And I'd also like to extend my thanks to my colleagues who've been really instrumental in putting this together, especially my colleague Nicole. Thank you. And enjoy the rest of